You are my strength when I am weak. You are the treasure that I seek. You are my all in all.
Seeking you like a precious jewel, Lord, to give up I'd be a fool. You are my all in all. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name.
Taking my sin, my cross, my shame, rising again, I bless your name. You are my all in all.
When I fall down, you pick me up. When I am dry, you fill my cup. You are my all in all. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Jesus,
down, you pick me up.
Lamb
When I am
of
dry, you fill
God,
my cup.
worthy
You are my all
is your
in all.
Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Worthy is your name.
We have been working through the Sermon on the Mount, and that is where we will find ourselves this morning. And when we began the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus introduced us to a conflict that existed. It was a conflict between the religious leaders and what they looked at as proof of being a righteous person, and what Jesus says God really meant. If you'll remember, the leaders always focused on the outward things, things they could measure, things they could see. They were all about watching people's behavior and looking for those things they could write down and notice. Outward actions, the visible things of life, were of the most importance to them. They followed a strict code called the oral tradition, which had been handed down by the rabbis and the teachers over the years, that said, you can do this or you can't do that. And it was their man-made interpretation of what the law, what the commandments that God had given meant. Everything there was outward focused, things that could be measured. They didn't care what you thought, it was what you did that was important. Along comes Jesus, who reverses that. And he says it is not the outward action that is of the most importance. Yes, it is important how we act, but he's more concerned with what is going on in here. He is more concerned with our attitudes, with how we think, and the things that are going on inside of us. We'll be in Matthew 5 this morning as we continue looking at this wonderful teaching of Jesus. We're going to begin in verse 21. And Jesus says here, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court.'" Jesus is going to introduce a series of topics where he says, "You have heard." That expression refers, that was how the rabbis referred to the Old Testament. They would say, "You have heard," and then they would give the teaching on that. And their teaching, again, was what they believed the commandments that God had given really meant. And the expression that was used by the rabbis, Jesus turns it around now, and he is going to explain what God really meant. This first one here, he is quoting, of course, from the Ten Commandments, and specifically commandment number 6, which is found in Exodus 20:13. Very simple, "You shall not murder." That's one of the big ones. In today's culture and in our society, there are some of the Ten Commandments that are not taken as seriously. There's things that people take more lightly than others. Jesus actually warned us about doing that, about saying, "I'll follow this one, but that one's not as important. I don't need to follow it." But it still happens. This one is still upheld. Everyone would agree that it is wrong to murder. The exception in our country comes to when we're talking about an unborn child. But just about anywhere, everyone would agree murder is wrong. We don't do that. It's not acceptable. In many states in our country, it is punishable by the most severe penalty, death. Jesus says here that whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court, in other words, found guilty. So there's an understanding even back in those days that murder was wrong. You know, we know murder is the outward act of taking someone else's life. Murder is a measurable offense. The Pharisees, even if they didn't witness the actual murder, could see the after effects of it. They could measure that. Someone who committed murder would face the consequences for taking a life. There's not a lot of wiggle room in there on this one. But Jesus expands the understanding of the sixth commandment and what it means to us. And he says in verse 22, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." Jesus is not contradicting the teaching of Moses. He is, however, contrasting the interpretation that was followed by the scribes and the rabbis and the Pharisees. They had that oral tradition of teaching that explained what they thought God meant. Now, God in the flesh, Jesus, God Himself, is going to say, no, this is what the meaning behind that is. He has come to explain. He has come, as He told us, to fulfill the law, to explain it fully so that people know how they should live by it. While murder is an observable outward act, one of the things that the religious leaders could measure, God is more concerned with the inner attitude. Jesus explains here it is the anger that fuels the outward action that is the issue. He says that anyone who is angry shall be guilty. And whoever says something derogatory to his brother shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, back in those days, who was the top court in the land. He uses a term here. He says, if you even say a good for nothing, some of your translations have raka in there. And that's a word that means empty-headed, literally. The view of a man who has no sense, who is a numbskull, has nothing going on up there. Getting angry and assuming a position of superiority over another person by calling them derogatory names is wrong. In the first part of this verse, Jesus makes it clear that even getting angry about it is wrong. You don't even have to say it out loud. If you think in your mind, you are just as guilty. Jesus is equating the commandment not to murder with another command given over in Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 19, the law that God gave stated this. It says in verse 17, "You shall not hate your fellow countryman in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him." Hate your countryman in your heart. We aren't supposed to do that. If I ask for a show of hands this morning, how many of you have physically murdered somebody? There aren't going to be any hands going up. But if we had a show of hands for how many of us have been guilty of Jesus' expanded teaching here, there would be a bunch of hands held high. And Jesus has said that just thinking badly is the same as the outward action. The root of murder is anger, and anger is murderous in principle. What Jesus is saying is that if the root is present, a person violated God's law, even if the root hasn't yet produced the fruit, the outward evidence. You haven't conformed to that better righteousness that Jesus is talking about simply by not killing someone. And this is an important idea. And there is a reason why it is the first one of the examples that Jesus gives. When the original 10 Commandments were given, you can basically break them down into two parts. The first part is how we interact and deal in our relationship with God. Then we have the second part, which is how we interact in our relationship with other people. When we get to the part where we interact with other people outside of our parents who we are commanded to honor, the first command given was one not to murder. Life is placed at the head of these commandments because it is the basis of human existence. See, we are all created in the image of God. And to desire to harm someone, to do wrong to someone, to murder someone who has been made in God's image is an offense towards God. Jesus has expanded our understanding of this command to include our inward thoughts and attitudes and those things that are behind the outward action. He tells us that just having the inward thought makes us guilty, and he says we're guilty enough to be sent into the fiery hell. Outside of Jerusalem, there was a place called the Valley of Hinnom, and it was there that they burned the refuse and the trash from the city. It's like the big city dump, and it was always on fire. It was always smoking and smoldering. The word that comes from is a transliteration, the word he uses here for hell. It was a reminder to the people about the judgment that would come for the wicked. 1 Corinthians 6, Paul gives a list of ongoing behaviors that are evidence of the unrighteous, and Jesus says that just having the attitude, you don't have to go out and murder somebody. If you just think about doing it and wish them dead, you're just as guilty. You're guilty of that same unrighteousness. And next, Jesus gives us two illustrations exposing the seriousness of anger that he's just told us we're not to have. The first one is in the context of temple worship. In verse 23 says, "Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you," I want to stop right there. You were heading to worship. Part of worship back then was bringing your offerings. They were still under the sacrificial system, and offerings were brought to atone or to pay the penalty for sin that you may have committed. Jesus gives an example of someone who is on the way to the altar who remembers that there is a conflict. The first thing to note here is Jesus doesn't assign guilt. Maybe this brother has done something against you that has created the conflict. Or maybe the conflict is because you have done something to him. Jesus doesn't say if he did something to you. He says if you are aware of the conflict. We're much more likely to remember something that is done to us than something we may have done to someone else. Oftentimes, harm is intentional, but also there's a lot of cases where it's unintentional, where we hurt someone by a word that wasn't exactly what we meant, something that came out wrong. Maybe a failure to acknowledge someone. We say something and it just doesn't come out right. We didn't mean it that way. And sometimes those things create conflict. You can think of all of the situations, and it's even more prevalent in our society today with all these new ways to communicate with people. People can be hurt by words. They can be hurt by being snubbed, things like that. The problem here is it doesn't matter how it happened or who did it. There is a conflict, and here is how he says we should handle it in verse 24. He says, "Leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering." The first thing to do is fix the situation. Jesus says that the offering is of less importance than the interpersonal relationship with your brother or your sister. You need to fix that first. Go and be reconciled. We know what happens when we let things sit and stew and simmer, and then they blow up. And he says, when you're made aware of a conflict, regardless of who's at fault, try and get it rectified. Deal with it. To obey the law of love, to practice love to our brothers and sisters is far more important than our sacrifices. Jesus says we are to postpone the sacrifice instead of postponing the reconciliation. Unreconciled conflict is an absolute killer in any family, in any group, in any friendship, in any organization, in any church. It's something that needs to be fixed. There is someone you need to be reconciled with. Follow Jesus' teaching. He doesn't say if they did you wrong. He merely says if you're aware there's a problem, go and be reconciled. At the end of our service this morning, we will have a time of reflection and a time of response. And if you know that there is some reconciliation that needs to go on, take that opportunity to start dealing with it. We can't let things fester. All of us know what conflict is. We have conflict with our friends. We have it in our families sometimes. We have it in our group here sometimes. We have it in our community at times. Conflict is unavoidable, but Jesus says when we know there's a problem, we deal with it. We're instructed to do that. God is not impressed with our offerings and sacrifices when there's turmoil going on inside of here. That was an example of dealing with conflict in the temple in the worship sense. Now he gives an example of dealing with conflict outside of the faith community. In verse 25, he says, "Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison." In this scenario, two people are in a dispute and are on their way to the judge. They've decided to let an outsider decide the case. Each party goes before the judge, they present their case, and then they allow the judge to decide. That sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? That's what we do here. You know, we have a legal dispute, sometimes it ends up in court, where we allow a judge to make a decision regarding who is at fault and then what penalties or damages may be incurred. I mean, that kind of sounds like the fair way to do it, doesn't it? That's how we normally handle things. There is a hidden danger in that, the approach to do that. And Jesus is pointing it out here. And he's saying, when you do that, you are putting your fate, the outcome of the situation, in the hands of one person. Maybe somebody you don't even know. And Jesus says that while you're on your way to court, get the situation worked out. Call it a settlement. Sometimes we hear it called a plea bargain. The point is not to let the dispute get all the way to the judge. Work it out. Jesus says to make friends. We need to get rid of the anger and tension and get the problem solved. Treat the other person like a friend, not an adversary, because the possible outcome is not very good. Being handed over to the judge means the decision is given into his hands. You and the party that are having the dispute and the conflict, you have some sort of a relationship. You might be friends, might be a neighbor, maybe a family member. And you're inviting an outsider into your relationship. An outsider who will make a decision that can affect you. And Jesus says if he rules against you, the officer takes over, and in this case, he says you're thrown into prison. And then he says, verse 26, "Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent." Back in first century Israel, if you owed a debt, you were thrown into jail or prison until the debt was completely paid off. A dispute, one that could have been worked out ahead of time while on your way to court to visit the judge, can be so expensive that it costs you not only your money but your freedom. That's a great cost to you and a great cost to your family. And Jesus says, and what he prescribes here is that you resolve the problem before you allow someone else to come into the relationship and have a say in how things are handled, especially when there's something that can just be devastating to your family. The underlying root problem of most conflict is anger. Think about disagreements and conflicts that you've had in your life. When I think back on all of them that I've encountered, you know, it's often because something didn't work out my way. I didn't get my way in something. I didn't think what happened was fair. We have seen families torn apart by conflict. We have seen schools, churches, communities that suffer because of conflict. When we allow anger to become a driving force in our lives, the result is often conflict. And Jesus says we need to take every effort to rid our lives of conflict, to get it resolved, to not allow other people, outsiders, into our lives that have the ability to make decisions as a result of our actions. Now we move to another topic that deals with our relationships with each other. In verse 27 and 28, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus takes on the seventh commandment, Exodus 20:14. It's a commandment that stresses the sacredness of marriage. And the law was very clear that this is something that you don't do. The offense was often treated by the Jewish rabbis not so much as a function of purity, but as of theft. To commit adultery was to steal someone's wife. That's how they looked at it. They focused more on it as an aspect of theft. And there was a penalty assigned for that in Leviticus chapter 20. The law called for the stoning to death of both parties. That's correct. The punishment that was prescribed was both parties to be stoned, but it was taken very seriously, but part of it was for the wrong reason. Instead of purity, it was more of possession. And Jesus corrects the understanding when he expounds upon the commandment. He says it isn't the act that is important, it is the attitude. Look at what Jesus said about murder. If you even think that way in your mind, it's wrong. Here he says you even look at a woman with a view to enticing her to lust, he is committing adultery with her. The thought that would lead to the act is where Jesus focuses. Jesus' words in verse 28 may sound familiar to you. You know, we're in the middle of a presidential election year, if you hadn't noticed. 40 years ago, 1976, another presidential election, and these exact words played a very important role in the election. Jimmy Carter, former governor of Georgia, won the Democratic nomination for president. He was running against Gerald Ford. If you'll remember, Ford had been appointed vice president when Spiro Agnew had to resign. He then became president when Richard Nixon had to resign. He had not been elected to the office, but he was the sitting president. It was a very tight race. In September of that year, Jimmy Carter gave an interview to two freelance reporters. They then took that, put the interview together. They eventually sold it to Playboy magazine. And it caused quite a stir in Carter's campaign in September of that year. See, during the course of the interview, President Carter was very open about his faith. Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher. He still is. And he's been in church all of his life. And he was very open during that election about being a born-again Christian. And he was asked about it during the interview. I want to read to you, these are Carter's own words of how this happened and what transpired. In Jimmy Carter's own words, he says, "Well, I was asked by the Playboy interviewers, with whom I should have been more cautious, as he was leaving my house. The interviewer said to me, 'Since you are a born-again evangelical Christian, I guess that means that you consider yourself to be superior to most of the other people in this country, that you've escalated yourselves above others on a moral basis.'" That's a prevalent belief. Jimmy Carter replied and said, "No, that's not the case at all. And I was trying to explain to him some phrases from the Sermon on the Mount where Christ said that we shouldn't distinguish between ourselves if our hearts are filled with hatred and compare ourselves favorably to someone who has actually committed murder. And we shouldn't distinguish between ourselves who may have lusted for another woman outside of marriage with someone who had actually committed adultery." And I said, that's a distinction. Christ says, don't judge others, look at your own problems. And the interviewer said, "Well, have you ever committed adultery?" And I said, "No." Then the interviewer asked me, "Have you ever lusted after a woman outside of marriage?" And I said, "Yes." And that was the end of the interview. When that interview was published, Carter says he dropped 12 points in the poll. It came out in September. He rallied and he won the election in November by a very scant margin. But just dealing with the issue, Jimmy Carter said, I've thought about it. And that's what Jesus was after. See, Carter understood what Jesus was saying. It is the inward attitudes and thoughts that are important, because that's where outward actions begin. Jesus is concerned with the whole person, not just the outward actions of the person. And He wants us to protect ourselves from those situations. And this is what He says we're to do. Verses 29 and 30. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Right eye, right hand. They're causing a problem, you just gouge the eye out, cut off the hand. That sounds pretty severe, and it is. This is one of the figures of speech that Jesus uses. It's called hyperbole. It is an overstatement for the sake of emphasis. Jesus isn't commanding us to go gouge out our eye, because you know what? A blind person can still lust. He isn't saying go whack off your right hand if it causes you to sin, because you got another hand. You can kill somebody with that hand. He isn't teaching self-mutilation. It's instead an emphasis given to show how serious Jesus considered sin. Sin of the heart and the inner self, and how much He wanted us to fix it. We should understand the severity of sin and do everything we possibly can to stay away from it. If there's something in our lives that entices us or causes us to sin, we need to get rid of it. If we have certain attitudes that result in sin, change them. If we do certain activities, if we go certain places, if we look at particular things that entice us towards sin, we need to get rid of them. We need to look at them as an unhealthy part of our body, like He said about the eye and the hand, and purge them, get rid of them. Everybody in here is different. Every one of us, though, is the same in some aspects. We all face temptation. It's different for everybody here. Everybody here has a weak spot, or two, or many. We're all alike in that aspect. And Jesus says that our inward attitudes and our heart attitudes are important. And we shouldn't allow them to become sin, as He says, so we'd be like the wicked who are condemned to hell. We need to make the necessary changes, adjustments, whatever you would like to call them, to make sure we deal with sin. One of the best ways is to begin with is to remember this and meditate upon this verse. In the book of Philippians, in chapter 4, Paul talks about focusing upon things that are good. In Philippians 4:8, he says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things." Paul's prescription sounds like a great place to start. We need to examine ourselves and be honest. Are there areas in your life you struggle with? Are there things in your life that probably shouldn't be there? Do you harbor ill will towards someone? Do you have impure thoughts rolling around in your head? Do you have a bitter heart about something? Jesus says if we have a conflict that we are aware of, we need to deal with it. Some of you here this morning may have conflict in your lives. Some of you here this morning may actually have a conflict with God. You've never been reconciled back to Him. If you've never been reconciled back to God, as Jesus says, to be reconciled, if you've never done that, please consider the gospel message this morning. Gospel says that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and rose again on the third day. And Jesus tells us that if we believe that, if we admit our condition, if we believe that He died for our sins and rose again, and that if we confess it, begins with just telling God that, we confess that we are reconciled back to God. That's why Jesus came. If you've never considered being reconciled back to God, please take this time to do it. If you've already done that, if you've already placed your faith in Christ and been reconciled to God, please take this time to examine yourself. Is there somebody in your life you need to be reconciled with? Is there something you need to deal with in your life? Is there something you need to change in your life so that you rid yourself? Make a change in something you do so that you get rid of that temptation? Is there something like that that you need to change? As we have this time of response, please take a moment to consider that and take this time to begin the reconciliation process as Joe plays for us.